2024 is at an end, so in this video I'm going to recap the biggest climate stories from this year, review my predictions of 2024 from last year's video, and make some predictions about next year. The big headline this year was of course that 2024 saw global average temperatures be 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels for the first time. Note, by the way, that this doesn't mean we have crossed the 1.5 degrees threshold. That happens when we have been above 1.5 degrees of warming over a longer time period, so 20 or 30 years, not 1 year. This, at the moment, is a one-off. We expect the temperature anomaly to come down next year due to natural factors.
Notably, the natural El Niño Southern Oscillation is going to move into a La Niña phase with a cool Pacific, if it hasn't already, and that has huge impacts on global average temperatures. But that will be a temporary reprieve. In a couple of years, we will be above 1.5 again.
That's because the overriding factor behind the warming, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere increasing, they set a new record this year at 426.9 ppm in May, well, that isn't changing anytime soon. In fact, our carbon emissions continue to climb. This year, carbon emissions from energy-related uses will probably hit a new peak of 37.4 billion tons. The warming is going to continue, it's going to get worse. But if I was to pick a theme for 2024, it would be huge amounts of bad news, with good news caveats. And those caveats have been getting bigger every year. For example, CO2 emissions reaching a new high of 37.4 billion tons represents a 0.8% increase over last year. Energy-related CO2 emissions have almost flatlined for the past decade or so, helped of course by the pandemic, but with these quite small increases year on year.
The Global Carbon Project, based at the University of Exeter, estimates that CO2 emissions this year plunged in the EU and decreased slightly in the US, while increasing massively in India and modestly in most of the rest of the world, averaging out to make barely any difference in global emissions. But what about China, you may ask?
Well, the report estimates that China's emissions increased this year by 0.2% compared to last year. And several analyses indicate that China's emissions will fall next year and keep falling due to systematic changes. Maybe actually month on month that decline has already started.
That being made possible by the Chinese government's ambitious decarbonisation plans and spectacular rollout of renewables.
Let me be clear, it is not enough that the world's emissions are flatlining. We need to bring them down. The world needs to reach net zero to prevent further warming. But behind the big, scary headline, which is, again, very bad news, there's a more complicated picture, and there's a lot more good news than gets reported. Another example of that, on the subject of CO2, a study came out in October this year finding that the carbon land sink, so forests, mangrove wetlands, that kind of thing, sucking carbon out of the air, massively decreased in 2023, leading some people to speculate that the whole land carbon system was about to collapse. Well, that didn't happen. The global land sink has largely rebounded this year. Again, this is from the Global Carbon Project, and the amount of carbon sucked out of the atmosphere by the land is near the average for the past decade. In fact, did you know that 1, net land use emissions have declined significantly over the past 2 or 3 decades? That 2, about half of net emissions come from deforestation, a lot of it in the Amazon, and 3, that deforestation rates in the Amazon have plunged by 50% over the past 2 years. Positive caveats. But not everything that happened this year was positive or even had positive caveats. Let's go through some of the bad stuff.
First of all, a lot of natural disasters were intensified by climate change this year, notably heat waves during the Indian election, in Pakistan, during the Hajj, in Southeast Asia, and in West Africa. Flooding was also intensified many places, notably in Spain and India, and perhaps most visibly, the hurricane season in the Atlantic was especially devastating this year.
And alongside these human-oriented disasters, we also witnessed the largest coral bleaching event in history this year. 77% of the Earth's coral area was bleached due to massive marine heat waves. The oceans were particularly hot hot this year, something exacerbated, we believe, by a reduction in marine sulfate emissions from ships, which that in itself is a good thing, just it had this unintended side effect. In the first half of the year, a lot was also made of the possibility of climate change accelerating, so temperatures rising faster, sea ice retreating faster, oceans warming faster than expected, with the possibility that something fundamental in the climate system was now broken. A lot of op-eds came out about this, and while the jury is still kind of out, I think it's fair to describe the consensus opinion as warming has probably accelerated, but in a way that is entirely consistent with carbon emissions just being higher. We probably haven't fundamentally broken the climate system just yet. God, that's such a low bar. Why are we celebrating clearing that? Speaking of low bars, 2024 saw a record-breaking number of elections and international negotiations, and not all of them were complete disasters. In roughly chronological order, some highlights include Indonesia's election, which was probably a bad result due to the winner's attitude towards coal and deforestation, Russia's election, which was obviously a sham, India's election saw Modi's position slightly weaken, which will, I don't know, maybe result in some stronger climate policies in the long run, but I don't think it's going to change anything in the short term. In the European parliamentary elections, there was a slight shift towards the right wing, but not the disaster that a lot of people feared. It's probably not going to change European climate policy much. While in the UK, the centrist Labour Party took power, and they've already made some pretty big changes to the UK renewables sector. And yeah, I think that's it. I don't think I missed an election.
But if it was a mixed bag in elections, this year was an absolute shambles in international negotiations. COP16, so that's the biodiversity COP in Colombia, ended in disarray, with some progress on the representation of indigenous peoples, but lots of issues left unresolved. Negotiations for a global plastics treaty collapsed in South Korea due to a small number of petrostates torpedoing language around reducing plastic production, though a positive from that was that over 100 countries did support such language, raising the hope that maybe a non-global treaty could be agreed upon soon.
And of course there was COP29 in Azerbaijan. I've been making these recap videos for a couple of years now, and it feels like every year I say this, but man, what a disappointment. Another COP in a petrostate, another COP in which developing countries felt excluded, another COP in which language around the phase out of fossil fuels was danced around, but not with. This year was a little different, I suppose. The organisation of the conference seemed remarkably incompetent. There was the dramatic walkout, or near walkout, I suppose, of an alliance of developing nations over climate finance, and that resulted in an incredibly chaotic end to the conference, with an agreement made about climate finance, which included what looked on paper like a large number, but in reality represents a very small increase in the amount of finance being made available to the developing world. You can expect climate finance to massively dominate COP30, which is in Brazil next year. There's an early prediction for you. It's no wonder that Climate Action Tracker, which keeps track of different countries' carbon policies and translates them into an expected level of warming by the end of the century, has kept our trajectory at 2.7 degrees of warming, I think the most likely number, by 2100, which is where it's been for the past couple of years. Still a lot less than the disastrous business as usual trajectory that we were on. We have made a lot of progress. We just haven't made more progress recently. In fact, many people, including ex-Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon and the architect of the Paris Agreement, Christiana Figueres, have said this year that COPs just aren't fit for purpose anymore. Like, they were designed such that everybody had to agree on the final text, what we technically call consensus. But while that sounds great in principle, it means that a small number of countries, meaning the Russias and Saudi Arabias of the world, can stall action for everybody.
Maybe we need a new way of doing things. Quite what, I don't know. Climate Adam just made a video about this. Go watch their channel.
Oh, and whilst you're clicking links, there's one down in the description for a newsletter which keeps you updated on the big news in climate every month. I write that one. That's my newsletter. All right, yeah, okay, fine. Let's talk about the American election. Look, I said this at the time in a video over on my second channel. Wow, this is a hot fuzz moment. In all the years that I have been covering climate, I think this is probably the single worst piece of news I can remember receiving. The big number that everyone was throwing around was this analysis by Carbon Brief, which estimated that Trump could add 4 billion tons to US carbon emissions by 2030 compared to a Biden presidency. We don't know what it would have been compared to a Harris presidency, and I guess we never will. Some people have tried to find positives in this situation. It's probably not going to be 4 billion tons. I'd be surprised if it was that much of a difference, partly because there's a lot of stuff happening at the state level that's just going to carry on. Trump is obviously going to gut what's happening at the federal level, but individual states are going to carry on doing their thing. Some commentators have also argued that maybe with America withdrawing from markets for things like offshore wind, maybe that is going to intensify, concentrate those technologies in certain areas, which means they benefit from economies of scale. I think that's a bit optimistic, personally. I find it difficult to find actual positives in this news. To be honest, this is one of those moments that I really think we will look back on in climate history and say, that was a nexus point. That was the reason that we crossed this climate tipping point. This is why we lost 2 degrees by 2100. Like, it's on that level. It's really bad news.
Though, as I said in my video, it's not fatal for the global climate movement. Remember, the USA represents just about 1/8 of all emissions, and while Trump's actions will undoubtedly spill beyond his borders, he won't kill the push to lower emissions globally, because it just makes economic sense to do it at this point. And the adults in the room will continue their countries down that path.
Taken with news of record temperatures and climbing emissions and coral bleaching, though, it's easy to see why people have fallen into despair when it comes to climate change this year. Like, the planet has never been further from sustainability. The biosphere has never been under so much stress. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. 2024 was a really rough year to cover climate change. Or, I don't know, care about the future? But, as I alluded to at the start of the video, the picture is more nuanced than that. There are a lot more positives than people realize. So let's round out coverage of this year with some of those positive news stories.
Firstly, this year the world got more electricity from renewables than at any other time, more than 30%. In fact, the International Energy Agency believes that global electricity emissions have peaked and will now fall, something made possible by the incredible rise of renewables and the increasing move away from coal.
But what about the crazy number of Chinese coal-fired power plants, I hear you ask? Well, yes, they do keep building them. Yes, they represent the vast majority of new coal-fired power plants in the entire world. But, bizarrely, they don't necessarily mean that China's burning of coal is going to increase going forwards because of how they're used in the Chinese grid. It's quite specific to China, and also how new power plants get approved on a province level. Go read Hannah Ritchie's Substack entry on this. It's very interesting. But one of the main conclusions of that piece is that a lot of people believe that Chinese coal emissions have either already peaked or will very soon.
Matching the trajectory in much of the rest of the world. The G7 committed to phasing out coal by 2035 in April this year, and notably the UK made lots of headlines by turning off its last coal-fired power plant in September, ending 142 years of burning the fuel for power.
These moves being made possible, of course, by the incredible progress made in renewables and storage this year, and frankly for the past couple of years. Consultancy RMI released this report in June this year, finding that change in the renewables and storage sector has been exponential, outpacing basically all predictions, with costs being reduced by up to 80%. And the normally conservative IEA has also released a report predicting that renewables are just going to explode this decade, almost, but not quite, hitting the ambitious United Nations target of tripling renewables capacity by 2030. But something that's important to bear in mind when it comes to these impressive global statistics, especially around renewables, is that a lot of the progress has come from China, and to a lesser extent, Europe, and that at some point in the not too distant future, all of the gains that can be made in those economies will have been made, and they will have basically decarbonized. And it'll be down to the rest of the world, looking at you, America, to carry on the fight and to bring down their emissions. They will, of course, be doing that with the benefit of proven technology and cheaper technology than at any point in history. If you want a positive slant on 2024, it is that the year showed we have the solutions to the climate crisis to bring down our emissions, and they are cheaper and better than at any point in human history. Now, as I said at the beginning, I made some predictions about 2024 last year. So let's go back and review how well I did and how well those predictions matched up with reality, and make some new predictions about 2025. But before doing so, I do just want to take a moment to reflect on the incredible journey this YouTube channel has been on this year. As I said in my recent video on meeting the Prime Minister, yes, that's a thing that happened, go check it out if you haven't seen it, it was kind of a nuts story. I started this year nearly quitting this job because while I thought I was making high quality videos, nobody was watching them. And I am only still here. I've only had the opportunity to make more videos that are now starting to get more views because of the generosity of this community. If you have shared one of my videos, bought my book, turned up to a talk, signed up to a sponsor, recommended me to a friend, thank you. Not only have you allowed me to keep doing this job, you've allowed me to do it better. I've now got this incredible new studio. That allowed me to move out of my house from the second bedroom, and that meant that my daughter now has a bedroom. And not only have you kept my editor Luke employed, you've also, through contract work, kept several young people employed in this really difficult to manage intersection between art and science. You've added value to the world. Thank you. And the people who have particularly made that possible are the wonderful people who have signed up to support me at patreon.com/SimonOxFizz. This year, patrons have enjoyed lots of exclusive content, including a documentary about how I designed and built this YouTube studio, extended interviews with experts, blooper reels, a vlog every month, and got early access to all my videos, and at higher tiers, voted on a video topic a month. If you would like to join them, then please head to the link in the description, where the lowest tier is just £3 a month. And it really, really does make a difference. Normally, I shout out 3 randomly chosen patron names in a video, but just this once, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you so much. With all that said, let's go back and review my predictions about 2024 from last year. The first one of which was 2024 being warmer than 2023, but not quite 1.5 degrees. So I was half right, half wrong. Secondly, I predicted that COP29 would double down on carbon capture and storage due to its inclusion in COP28. And yeah, this one didn't happen, but it didn't happen because COP29 just didn't really do anything because of organizational incompetence and the justified walkout of developing nations. So yeah, got that one wrong. Thirdly, I predicted marine heat waves, especially around Australia, with a large coral bleaching event, and unfortunately, that is exactly what happened. Fourthly, I predicted that there'd be lots of analysis about the concurrent marine heat waves in 2023 and that we wouldn't get to the bottom of what was going on. And yeah, I think that's what's happened. There's been lots of analysis, and I haven't seen a true consensus develop, but like the land carbon sink issue, I think we are generally agreeing on the direction that we haven't fundamentally broken the oceans just yet. And lastly, I predicted that the climate culture war would deepen and that there would be a growing doomer movement. And boy howdy was I right about that one. I mean, here in the UK election, for example, half of the appeal of the Reform Party was that they were anti-net zero. Obviously, we saw a lot of similar narratives in America. And on the doomer movement, that actually ended up being my most popular video of the entire year. So yeah, unfortunately, I was right. So I think I've got a pretty decent track record, actually, over my predictions. So let's push my luck and make some more about 2025. Firstly, global temperatures will fall below 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's a pretty easy prediction, to be honest. I mean, we're entering into La Nina phase. I'm very confident that this one's going to happen. Secondly, Trump is going to gut climate policies at the federal level, and it's probably going to shock even people who keep an eye on this industry. But I do think that the climate movement and initiatives to reduce emissions will continue at the state level, and that's where the leadership is going to come from within America. On the international stage, I predict that a few countries are going to throw their hat into the ring for who is going to be the climate leader. The UK has actually done that. Ed Miliband threw his hat into the ring at COP29. Realistically, I think China is going to position itself as the climate adult in the room. expect that, I think, at COP30. Thirdly, more predictions will be made about the rapid rollout of renewables, and this one feels a little risky. I think we're going to blow past them again. I think the past few years have taught us that we keep underestimating just how fast the world is rolling out renewables, and specifically solar. I think specifically actually keep an eye on solar rollout in Pakistan. It made a few headlines this year. Next year, it could be quite a big story. Prediction number 4, all eyes are going to be on Antarctica in the austral summer. So where ice extent is at its lowest in Antarctica, for the past 2 years, we've seen it at record low levels. If that continues for a third year, a lot of people are going to start talking about something fundamental being broken in the cryospheric system in the southern hemisphere. And maybe that has already happened. And lastly, COP30. So, anything could happen. I predict that because it's in Brazil, a lot of emphasis is going to be put on preventing deforestation. That's like a big national priority in Brazil at the moment. Climate finance is going to be the spectre hanging over the entire conference, and especially with the failure of COP29, the pressure is on. If an agreement can be made, fantastic. If not, and I think that's more likely, my spicy prediction is that COP30 will be the last COP as we know it, and that calls to reform the whole system will get really loud. What will replace it, I don't know, but the spicy prediction is COP30, maybe the last COP. 2024 was a year in which the stakes were just raised higher and higher. The movement to prevent climate change has never had so much momentum. Our response to the crisis has never been stronger. But unfortunately, the nature of the challenge has also never been greater. This century is a tale of two wedges. One, the escalating impacts of a warmer planet, with jumps due to climate tipping points. And the other, the response to that crisis, and the escalating rollout of low-carbon technologies and new ways of doing things. 2024 showed the thin end of both wedges. The thin end of the thick wedge of impacts of climate change, and the thin end of the thick wedge of our response to it. It could be seen, retrospectively, as the first decisive year in the positive story of how we brought emissions down and combated the crisis with new technologies and lots of renewables. Or the first decisive year in our failure to do so, with emissions reductions just slipping out of our grasp with COP29 and the American election. It's easy to say, well, I guess time will tell. But that surrenders responsibility to the future. It is still absolutely in our power to choose which history we get to retrospectively tell. And that starts with the first month, the first week, the first day of 2025. As I've already said, finance is going to be one of the biggest issues at COP30, and frankly, one of the defining issues of the climate movement going forwards. Not only where should the money come from, but also where should it be spent? Any allocation of funding for a specific purpose needs to have evidence that it works, whether that's reducing emissions or adapting to a warmer climate or helping people who are already affected by climate change.
Over this year, I've actually highlighted several charities that do this work.
This is a time of year when you may be considering donating to charity. And if you watch this channel, chances are you're a person who would also value a scientific approach. You would value an independent, not-for-profit organization that collates research on the impacts of different charities and constantly interrogates how it does that so that it can best recommend charities to donors. Well, such an organization exists, and it's called GiveWell. GiveWell has spent the last 17 years researching charitable organizations and advising donors about where they can be most confident their donation will make a big impact, especially in the area of saving lives in impoverished communities. More than $2 billion, with a B, dollars has been donated through GiveWell by well over 100,000 donors, and they estimate that money will save over 200,000 people's lives. But here's the best part. GiveWell doesn't make money from donations. They're not for profit. They just want this information to be out there for as many people to use as possible. So, All of it is available for free. All of their research and their recommendations for top charities available for free on their website.
If you would like to use their resources and donate to one of the recommended charities, now would be an excellent time to do so, because first-time donations are being matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. So your generosity could double in impact if you donate before the end of 2024.
To get your donation matched, head to givewell.org, then pick YouTube, and then enter Simon Clark at checkout. So let them know that you heard about GiveWell from me in order to get your donation matched.
Again, that's givewell.org to donate or simply find out more about high-impact charitable giving. Please do give generously, and thank you, GiveWell, for sponsoring this video.
Thank you for watching this video, and indeed for watching all of my videos this year. 2024 was nuts, and I'm really looking forward to a break over Christmas. I'll be back in the new year with new videos, making full use of this incredible new space that I find myself with, trying to keep people informed and talking about the greatest issue of our time in what I hope will be an entertaining way. Of course, if you can't wait till then, here's 2 videos I prepared earlier. If you enjoyed this one, please do the YouTube pleasantries, drop it a like, maybe share it with somebody who you think would also enjoy a recap of the year in climate. And that just leaves me to say, thank you so much for watching. Happy holidays. I'll see you in the next one.